So I mean, it's a historical question because no one really ate these seed oils before about 100 years ago. The intake decade over decade of the average person grew all during the 20th century. It hit this, today's all-time high. The stat that I gave you, I think before we hit record, was average American gets 20 to 30% of their daily calories from seed oils. It's not that it's not that eating any quantity of omega-6 fats is necessarily concerning or bad. It's all about the quantity and ratio to other nutrients in the diet. So omega-6 fats are essential. You definitely have to get around 1 to 2% of your daily calories from omega-6 fats, which is easy. They're in a lot of foods. They're in you know, many whole foods, vegetables, certainly nuts and seeds and grains. They're in animal products. It's really hard actually to be deficient in omega-6 fats. The only people that are typically ever deficient in omega-6 fats are either, being fed hospital nutrition that's poorly formulated, or they have some kind of like gut malabsorption issue, or, actual literal starvation and malnutrition. Modern people, it's kind of unheard of to be deficient in omega-6 fats. Where we've moved as a civilization is the availability and prevalence of these fats has resulted in a much higher omega-6 fat intake. That's how I would frame it. Like, for starters, all of the traditional oils and fats that you mentioned, tallow, butter, olive oil, um, most animal fats are much lower in omega-6 compared to modern seed oils. So when we look at just the sheer quantity of intake, people have much higher, you can measure it in plasma or adipose tissue, like 3, 4, 5 times higher historical levels of omega-6 fats in the body. Now, if that's really a problem for everybody all the time is kind of a separate discussion. I would just suggest that, doing something differently these past 100 years that's never been done before in human history certainly deserves closer examination.
Yeah.
The other thing too, because you mentioned cooking and you mentioned smoke point. And probably most of your audience knows that omega-6 fats are also polyunsaturated fats, meaning they have two or more double bonds. This makes them more oxidation prone, particularly when heated. So, very often when people are eating seed oils, the seed oils are heated before you ingest them, whether you're cooking at home using, so-called vegetable oil, which is soybean oil, corn oil, canola oil, sunflower oil, any of these seed oils. If you're using them for cooking, you're heating them. So that high polyunsaturated fat content results in more rapid degradation when heated. This is also the case for those packaged foods, or, processed and ultra
Yeah.
processed foods. They're typically heated before, during manufacture, before being packaged and eaten. It's certainly true at restaurants. So there are these, this broad class of byproducts called lipid oxidation products, or LOPs, that are produced at a much higher rate when polyunsaturated fats are heated. So, that's actually not even controversial. Like, the consequences of high omega-6 intake are more controversial. The lipid oxidation product issue is actually a lot less controversial. That's essentially why people say don't eat fried foods. You know, well, why are
Yeah.
fried foods worse for you than like a sautéed? Why is it okay to saute a potato for a little while or bake it, but it's not okay to fry it? That's because of the lipid oxidation products. So we're talking about molecules like aldehydes, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, polymer like molecules. Any seed oil that's high in polyunsaturated fats forms these molecules at a much higher rate. And then the intake of them is cumulative. So, for people that are cooking frequently in seed oils or eating at restaurants frequently, whether the food is fried or not, restaurants, tend to push the limits of oils. And it's actually not directly reflected in the smoke point. In other words, soybean oil, typically will claim a smoke point of around 450 degrees Fahrenheit. Like, that's a really high heat for cooking. Most people are probably cooking more like around, 350 to 400 Fahrenheit. But compared to, say, olive oil, if you're cooking at 350 to 400, the soybean oil is forming a much higher level of these harmful byproducts, which is, again, not reflected in the smoke point. So I think people, even professional chefs are misled by this. They say, yeah, soybean oil, it's inexpensive, has a high smoke point, perfect for what I do. They're totally missing the point that even though it's not smoking, it's forming these lipid oxidation products at a much higher rate.
That is wild. So, what are the main health risks associated with consuming this kind of product? Like this just broken down, toxic things forming everywhere. Like, what can happen? What can happen to us?
Yeah, the aldehydes and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are, correlated. Exposure in general is correlated with higher cancer risk. Um, just broadly speaking, I would say that, when we get into measuring specific health outcomes, we have to look back. There haven't been a lot of randomized controlled trials. There have really been no good ones since about the 60s or 70s. There are three or four that do point to specific health concerns where, some groups of researchers in the 60s and 70s looked at actually randomizing people to, like, okay, group A here is going to eat a lot of corn oil, and group B is going to eat a normal diet for the time, which was, more animal fat based than today, and certainly more than the seed oil intervention group. The Minnesota coronary experiment found that seed oils do lower cholesterol, but for actually each increment of cholesterol lowering, there was a higher risk of death from all causes and heart disease.
Wow.
So, that's concerning. People today will sometimes criticize it and say, oh, it's like 50 years old, like we just need to throw it out. I would suggest that, don't throw it out. We need to do ideally more research like that. So that's something that I'd like to actually see, RFK and Maha do, is let's try to replicate this study if it's ethical to do that. And then we'll have, using up-to-date methods, we'll have better answers. There's one called the Sydney Diet Heart Study. I don't have the results of this in front of me right now, but people can look it up. And the Minnesota coronary experiment, the Sydney Diet Heart Study, the LA Veterans Trial, and the Rose Corn Oil Experiment. All of these were randomized controlled trials that, at minimum, they showed no benefit to substituting seed oils in place of saturated fats. And in some cases, they did show like statistically significant negative outcomes, like, in some cases, higher rates of heart disease, in other cases, higher rates of death by cancer. So that's like kind of, we can point to that and say, that's reason for concern. We can't say it's a smoking gun, case closed. Seed oils are going to do this all the time in everybody. One other just quick thing to throw in there, Mark, to your question is, we know that because of seed oils, people today have a much higher omega-6 to omega-3 ratio than ever before. In other words, most people are not eating more fatty fish. They're just eating more seed oils. They're not
Yeah.
compensating by eating more fatty fish. And there is good observational evidence, like really recent observational evidence, showing that people with the highest omega-6 to omega-3 ratios do have higher rates of death from all causes, death from cardiovascular disease, and death from cancer.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to inflammation. You know, there's actually in the supplement industry, they were selling arachidonic acid because it's pro-inflammatory. And what causes muscle growth?
Sure.
Inflammation. So I tried it, right? And I tore up my shoulder. I'm like, this is not good. I can't make gains if I'm injured. So I think you're looking at pro-inflammatory issues. I always say inflammation is Satan. Like systemic inflammation is terrible. Now, obviously, acute inflammation after a workout will lead to, hypertrophy. It helps do that. But when you're looking systemically, you want to minimize your inflammation systemically, because cytokines, all that good stuff, things go crazy, you're more likely to get sick. So how do seed oils contribute to the inflammation and chronic diseases? Do you know of a pathway that exists?
Sure. Yeah. So this is a really interesting area of controversy to dig into. I'm going to tell you kind of the talking point from pro seed oil people, and I'm going to tell you some ways that it's limited, and then I'll also go into more depth on your question. So, um, you know, the conversion pathway from linoleic acid to arachidonic acid has 3 or 4 steps.